Previously on the 335D build, as we talked in our unboxing video, this is a drop knuckle. So where the axle and the wheel bearing and your wheel attaches to is physically higher in this knuckle. We can cycle it through and just see how that is going through its travel, and it only took me 3 bearings to do a 2 bearing job. We are running into a problem where the caliper on this rotor with the Wisefab knuckle, there's probably a 3/8 gap. So this is part 2. If you missed part 1, it's got a lot of information bringing you up to where we are now. So make sure you go watch that before you watch this one. So we're waiting on a few things for the subframe. We ran into the issue with the calipers. We need the spacers. So I ordered that stuff. And so now I want to put the subframe in the car. It's going to be easier to torque stuff down for the suspension and get that all finalized tight. There's no reason it can't go into the car. We have some brake line stuff, caliper stuff to do. But while we wait on parts, let's get it in the car and then we can work on other stuff. I didn't really realize it at the time, but I was actually fighting the anti-squat arms. Those bolts that I put in there, they were a little long. I had to switch the orientation so that they didn't run into the body, but when I switched them, they still ran into the body because they were too long. So I was actually fighting it in the front, trying to align that subframe. I did get it in there, and I used the subframe bolts to pull it up in there, but the bolt was actually rubbing on the body as it goes up, so it kind of self-clearanced. But later on in the build, I do shorten those so that we don't have that interference when or if I need to remove those arms completely. So we have the subframe back in the car, finally. It looks really good in here. We have everything torqued to spec and marked. We had to swap around a couple of the bolts for the control arms because I had them in there the wrong way and they were going to run into the body. So before we shoved that up in there and couldn't get them out, swap those around, specifically the top ones. We need those to go towards the front of the car so they don't run into the coil bucket going backwards. And then the front upper control arm, we want that going to the back of the car so it doesn't run into the subframe mount. So everything's in. We're waiting on parts for the rear calipers so we can finally get the foot brake and the hydro all set up. We're going to run new lines to that and then run the dedicated line up to the hydraulic handbrake in the interior part. All right, so we're back today. We got some parts that we were waiting on, and we're going to try and finish up most of the brakes, getting at least the calipers mounted on these rear with the foot brake and the hydro, and then tidy up a couple other things we got some parts for. The issue yesterday was the caliper was about 3/8 of an inch away from the caliper mount of where it needed to be. So Wisefab had already put, roughly a 1/4 inch spacer in there, and we were still 3/8 of an inch away from that. So I got some standoffs or some spacers, whatever you want to call that. So essentially this is what we're going to be doing. So we have the Wisefab spacer, and then I'm going to weld this spacer to that. And then we have these longer bolts. These are grade 10.9 high strength, same as what BMW put in there, 50 millimeter long. So they should be able to go through the knuckle, through the spacer, and then into the caliper and be just as safe as factory. So we're going to be welding these on, and then they get pinned into the knuckle. So we're going to get this rotor off and double check that everything works. We're going to mock it all up. Then I'm going to pull this off, put just a couple tack welds just so that when you pull apart the caliper, you don't lose these spacers. And we're going to be mounting the 2 calipers today, and then we're still waiting on some brake line fittings so that we can run brand new brake lines to the foot brake and to the hydro. Hopefully we'll have those in the next couple of days. I just had to do a bunch of measurements yesterday once we got all this together. I also got a couple of new push pins so that we can tidy up the wheel speed sensor wiring, and then there's also a brake pad sensor that we're just going to loop because we don't need that. I don't want to run that. All Alright, so Wisefab uses these roll pins to hold in these spacers that they gave. So they use these little roll pins that they punched into their spacers to hold them to the knuckle. So each one got 2. Now I'm just going to hammer those back a little bit because I got to take these spacers on and off a couple times and I don't want to pry them off every time. So we're just going to hammer those back a little bit. Then take our spacer, bolt through there, little round file, take some of the burrs off. Also take off my nice powder coat, but whatever. There we go. This one doesn't have burrs, but it's a little tighter than I want. There we go. These bolts have a little bit, slightly bigger shoulder than what BMW's factory bolts were. And Wisefab sends you with a couple of new bolts for these as well, depending on what setup. We have regular 3 series, and I believe these are set up for M3 brakes. So the reason these are catching on a couple is the shoulder of this bolt is just slightly bigger. So in this hole, the powder coat kind of got in the way. This other hole had a burr from when these plates were laser cut. So now that's all fixed. Now we can slide this up, put that on, this other bolt in. Then we're going to slide a spacer on each one. So these are the calipers that came off this car, just because they have pads in them. I'm going to try and use these. I'm going to plug this brake fluid hole so it'll stop getting brake fluid all over my fresh powder on this Wisefab. Just got little silicone plugs in those brake line holes. Alright, now the main thing is that this caliper bracket is centered on the rotor. It's the main thing. Because the caliper itself is floating, right? So that as the pads wear, that kind of self-adjusts. That's why you have caliper slide pins in the back here. But my concern is that this caliper bracket is centered, and in this case, it is not. It is actually touching the rotor. So we need to take a little bit of height off of these spacers. Maybe a 16. Probably taking the coating, the nickel chrome coating off these spacers would give me that 16th of an inch. So we're just gonna flap this that, which I would have had to do for welding it anyways, and then we'll double check. Now this is not the most accurate way of doing this, but it will be just fine. A little bit of deburring. Get fancy with it. So I haven't taken this caliper off. I'm modifying this side so that I know what's wrong over here. I can replicate it or fix it on this side and then replicate it with these spacers. Test to fit this side. Looking much better on this side. Let's tighten her up, double check. Looking better, but still not quite there. So we probably have 3/16 clearance on that side and maybe a 16th on that side. What I want, 1/8 of an inch on both sides. So I need to take off another 16 off of those spacers to be able to bring that caliper bracket inwards a little bit. Because when I tighten it up, it seems to tweak the caliper. When it wasn't tight, it looked really good. So here we are, tight, now looking good. But dual calipers on here looks pretty good. I'm going to grind down all these spacers, obviously take off quite a bit on all 4 of these for this side, and then go from there, and I can replicate that on the driver's side once I have it fine-tuned, assuming that everything is the same on the other side. This is a fabricated knuckle. It's not cast and machined, so there's going to be some differences side to side. I'm assuming. Can't expect perfection. That's a little bit tedious, so I'm just going to knock that out, deal with this real quick, and then I'll touch base with you guys again. So that took a lot longer than I planned. Very tedious, especially when you're using a grinder. It's not the most accurate way of doing it. Ideally, these spacers are put in a mill, and you are able to mill these perfectly flat, or flatter than you can with like a grinder like I'm using, but I don't have a mill. So using what I have on hand, this is the 1/4 inch spacer. It's just under a 1/4 inch, so probably 6 mil, 7 mil. That Wisefab provides, and that they have roll pinned into their knuckle. And then I've taken the spacers that I got, ground them down, welded them to that bracket, and they get me pretty close, within 20 thou of where I want to be. So then I'm just using very, very thin shims on the back here to fine tune that for each one. Again, since it's not milled, they're not perfect. Each one takes a little bit different than the other, but I'm able to get the brackets centered on the rotor, I'd say within 5 thou. So pretty good, and I don't think the rotor can deflect enough to hit the bracket, so shouldn't have any issues on the track while drifting this. So gonna final set these up, and then I'm gonna pull these calipers back off. We're going to paint them, make those look pretty, get everything final assembled, and then we're going to be doing the soft lines. We're converting to -3AN stainless steel lines to go to the subframe, and then hard lines up to the factory junction goes to the chassis. I'm going to add one for the hydro, and we're going to be coming down the trans tunnel out of the factory e-brake hole so that we keep everything nice and tucked up and out of the way. So this is the most tedious part. This isn't in the instructions for Wisefab. There's not much in the instructions for Wisefab, so you really have to figure this out yourself, and it really depends on what brakes you're running. These are 330, 335 brakes, and rotor M3 brakes are different, and 328, 325 brakes are different. So this kit doesn't work with the smaller ones that are on like 328s. So you have to run this size rotor, which is, I want to say 34 or 548 millimeters, something like that. It's either 548 or 558, but you have to run the larger of the non-M brakes for this to work. So then I have the caliper spaced, so the brackets are centered. The caliper itself is floating, so that's relatively irrelevant. So we just need to hook everything back up, but that was a lot more tedious than I would have liked. That took most of the day, unfortunately. But we have these. They get me close, they're sturdy, and then I can shim just slightly and get them within 5 to 10 thou of perfectly centered. We're going to be moving along to other things in the subframe and try and get this finished up. So there's a 50 thou spacer here on the bottom, thinner on the top, thinner on both of those. Test. Okay, that's pretty good. Let's try this other side. Both need to come out farther. Okay, now let's try this. Put a little bit more into it. Pretty well spot on with that. Not hitting. Perfect. So then we're going to get into the hard lines. Now that we have the subframe in, we can know exactly where to put the hydro line. When we build that hard line, we can build the hard lines off of the broken hard lines that we had off of it originally. So we just bent those up to match that, installed all that. We're using the factory soft lines to go back to the chassis and go to those brake lines that go up to the ABS module. But we want the subframe up in there so that we know where the hydro, the dual caliper mount can go. So we were able to use some rib nuts and put a hardline adapter to a -3AN bracket up on the chassis right next to where the factory soft lines are, and then we go to a -3T fitting that allows one brake line to come in, two going out, one to each side of that handbrake caliper on this rear subframe. So then we build the hard lines off of that, going to the factory brake line brackets. BMW put the factory hardline, softline meeting area bracket pretty far out there, and then they had a conveniently placed like 1/4 inch pilot hole, and so I opened that up with a step bit to accept another one of those M10 by 1.0 hardline fittings, and then it adapts it to -3AN so we can run our soft lines to those calipers with a stainless steel soft line. So I was able to open up and put both of them right next to each other. So I ran the hard lines and had one for the foot brake and then the hand brake, and they were placed both in the same bracket. Looks very nice, very clean. From there we were able to get at least one of the soft lines to the caliper and run that. Also with this Wisefab kit, it does not have a provision for the adaptive headlight sensor. The front and rear of this E90 with the adaptive headlight option has a level sensor, and it reads off of the lower control arm. So in the rear here, a lot of people don't put this Wisefab in a street car. So it's understandable that it doesn't have a provision, but I didn't know that going into it. So I mounted up the sensor to the factory location on the subframe, and then I measured the stock lower control arm so that I knew how far the sensor would sit from the pivot point of the bolt to where it mounts on the factory control arm. And then I took that measurement and copied it onto the Wisefab. I drilled and tapped a M6 hole so that I was able to attach that directly to the Wisefab control arm, modified the locating bracket a little bit. So I'm using the factory sensor, the arm that goes down to the bracket, and then the bracket that goes onto the Wisefab control arm. So we're able to retain that headlight sensor in the rear, and then we'll have to do something custom for the front as well when we get to that. And then with the Wisefab knuckle, they relocate the wheel speed sensor. They put it on the bottom so that you're able to keep it with dual calipers. And with that, the line kind of runs to the factory locations, but there was a section that ran right next to the lower control arm that was kind of just flailing around, and I don't want that to kind of swing into my axle and get rubbed on and eventually rubbed through. So I drilled another hole into the Wisefab control arms and put a push pin or a cable tie pin so that I was able to cable tie that down to the control arm, keep it nice and tidy, and then go up to the factory locations on the subframe with the level sensor plug as well, and then hide that all in the factory location behind the wheel liner, keep it all out of harm's way. So I'm drilling and tapping the Wisefab knuckles. Wisefab send it to you with a 1/4-inch roll pin to hold these caliper spacers in there. Now with me taking the Wisefab spacer, adding to it, and then I'm having to shim it with some really thin shims behind that, the roll pin doesn't have enough tension to hold those shims in there. And if I didn't do that and I would have just put the spacer on there and the shims at the back, I'd have to put the bolt through and the shims on there and then hold the caliper bracket. And it seemed like when I'm trying to do repairs at a track or repairs in general, that would get very frustrating. And I want the shims to stay on the bracket without gluing them or anything like that. So I'm drilling and tapping all the roll pin holes to accept the closest bolt size that I could get, which was 5/16. And we're going to be bolting the caliper brackets to the knuckle and sandwiching between that bracket and the knuckle the correct shims to get those caliper brackets where we want them to be. So in order for me to fit the bolts, because when I initially welded the spacers to these Wisefab spacers that they send, I did not anticipate having to use a bolt head, and so I had enough clearance for the roll pins, but I didn't for a button head bolt to go in there. So you'll see me clearancing those a little bit to allow the bolt to fully seat down and not push on a weld and bend the bracket in any way, shape, or form. So that allows me to place the correct amount of, I used 0.5 millimeter shims to get the bracket as centered as possible on that rotor so that we're not having the rotor rub on anything. And when we have maybe a little bit of rotor deflection, then it's still not hitting as much as possible without having to clearance the rotor bracket. So we're getting that all together. And then with the rear calipers, we're using the brake pads that came on the car. They still had good life left in them. So we're using that on the foot brake. I'm not too sure what company that is, but whatever, I'm sure it came with the drilled and slotted rotors. But on the handbrake side, I wanted a relatively soft pad or a grippy pad. Brake dust doesn't really bother me. I want, when I pull that handbrake, it to grab as much as possible. And on my previous drift cars, I have a track pad in there, but with a hydro, track pads want to get warmed up. They're very noisy before then, and it's hard to really warm up a hydro. It's pretty warm by the end of the day, but then it kind of cools down. So I didn't want that problem with this car. So I'm running some cheaper AutoZone semi-metallic pads that in my experience are pretty grabby and they don't require a heat up session. So I'm hoping that those are going to perform a lot better than the track pads that I'm used to. So we're going to place those in the secondary hydro caliper and then run the, I'm assuming, ceramic brake pads that came with the car in the foot brake area. And with the calipers, you'll notice a little kind of blue nipple on there, and that's covering up a AN fitting. So I adapted the calipers that are M10 by 1.0 thread, and then I adapted that to -3. So we have that coming out of the caliper so that we're able to adapt those to the stainless steel lines that I have going to the hardline bracket that we installed earlier. So we're going to get into installing the coilovers back into the setup, and I'm going to reuse the divorced setup, meaning the spring and the shock are separate, that came with this car. This is a Silver's coilover package. I'm pretty sure it's just an off-the-shelf. You order their kit, this is what they send you. It works great. It rode great in the car before. before, and I'm going to install it in this. Wisefab's lower control arm has provisions for a divorce spring setup or a true coilover setup, depending on what you want to run. And so I'm going to be placing the Silver's spring in there in this off-the-shelf kit. This has an 11K rear spring, and I'm going to run the height adjustment all the way up so that I can adjust it from there, because I don't know if there's any difference between the coilover control arms height-wise where the spring is. So I'm just going to run that all the way up so that the car essentially goes as low as it can, and then I can go up from there. So as I install this shock in this location, I'm realizing another frustration with this dual caliper setup. The soft line that I had coming out of the hydro, the secondary caliper, runs right into the shock. So I'm going to have to change up that idea. I was trying to have all the same soft lines in the rear, a straight and a 90-3 12-inch long brake line, so that I could just keep around a couple of those spares if I needed to, and it could go for any of the rear soft lines. But I'm going to have to change that idea up a little bit, and I think I have an idea to still use those, but I'm going to have to put a banjo fitting on that rear caliper so that I'll have the correct clearance. So some things that I wish I knew before I got the Wisefab kit. Now, there's not a lot of information out there on the internet, at least for the E90 setup. There is a Facebook support group, but you have to purchase it from that specific vendor. I purchased elsewhere due to getting a better deal, and so I was kind of left to figure it out myself. There's not a lot of written instruction when Wisefab sends you this kit. This is typically provided to race shops, drift teams, that they're used to this. They've done this numerous times on old chassis, and they're getting into this chassis or what have you. I've never installed Wisefab. This is my first time. I'm fairly confident with my mechanical capabilities, and I could figure it out, but I have experience with machining, I have experience with automotive, and have a pretty good idea of suspension. So I was able to figure it out to the best of my ability, and I may have still done things wrong. So I wanted to share what I learned, what I found out as I installed this kit for somebody who is looking to install this in, say, their backyard or their shop. We're going to start first with the bushing. So Wisefab sends you a uniball style for your lower control arm and your front trailing arm pickup points on the subframe. Now, there's no instructions on where to put those, if offset or whatever, so I assume that they wanted them perfectly centered in those holes. The lower control arm one, relatively self-explanatory. It's perfectly flush, so that one's pretty easy, I suppose. The front trailing arm, you kind of have to offset it just a little bit, and I kind of figured that out as I was going, but there's no instructions with that, so you're kind of figuring that out yourself. Now, I had mentioned this before, but Wisefab has no provisions for a level sensor if you have an adaptive system on your car. I wanted to keep that, so I modified the control arm to be able to accept the OEM bracket for that. As well, I prefer all my cables and everything to be tied down, so I added a cable tie area for the wheel speed sensor to be able to hold that in location and away from my axle. With Wisefab, you cannot run a stock location rear sway bar. There are some guys that have set up a blade style, FD style rear sway bar to be able to run that and not have to mess with their spring rates, but I would be fine without a rear sway bar if I could mess with these spring rates, which I'll be able to do with the new setup, but I wish that I knew that part, that you can't run a rear sway bar. The biggest hurdle is I was told that this kit fits this size brakes from the 335 or 330 with the larger rotors, or you can fit the M series brakes on it as well. They kind of fit. I mean, the spacing that I had to go through to get this correct, I wish the knuckle would make up for that, but I understand that the knuckle has provisions for multiple different brakes, and there's a lot of different brakes that came on these cars, so there's different variations of that. So spacing it, I can see how that would would be, but I wish that I just knew that going into it so I could prepare for it. Maybe I could order the parts ahead of time, having spacers on hand so that this wouldn't be delayed waiting for stuff, materials to be able to space that out properly, waiting for the correct bolts and things like that. So these are the things I wish I knew with the Wisefab kit going into it. It just would have made things smoother and would have got this done a lot faster. But you live and learn, and so I wanted to share my experience with this kit. Seems like a lot of people gatekeeps the information with this Wisefab kit. Not a lot of people put it out on the internet from what I can find. I did a lot of research before getting this kit, and I couldn't find a lot out there, again, without that Facebook support group, but you have to buy from that vendor. I chose not to do that. So I want to be as helpful as possible to ones that are interested in putting a Wisefab in the rear of their car. Just expect it is probably the most expensive option. The Wisefab kit itself is not cheap. I'm grateful that I'm able to have this kit and make it work. I hope that the car is going to drive phenomenal, and then I'm going to have all the adjustment in the world, and I can make the car drive just how I want it to, and I probably will drift this thing with a smile on my face and it'll all be worth it. But building it was just a little bit more work than I thought it would be. So reflecting on my choice to go with Wisefab, I wanted the most adjustability, and I believe that this kit does give you that with their knuckle setup and their control arm, moving the pickup points, although it can be frustrating to find out that certain things are moved. But I think that all in all, it's going to provide me the adjustment that I want and to be able to get this car to drive how I want. There are a lot of people who run just stock suspension and a lowered car and have no issues. And there's a lot of people who run adjustable arms, camber and toe, and have no issues. You know, maybe they deal with a little bit of uneven tire wear or what have you with that setup, and they're okay with that. There's also, to my knowledge, currently on the market, not really any other grip kits like the Wisefab, meaning that it either changes the pickup points on the knuckle or replaces the knuckle entirely. So I think that there are some in the future that might come out, but currently on the market, I believe the Wisefab to be the only one. If you know of one, let me know in the comments. So for me to get what I wanted and being stubborn with it, the Wisefab did give me that possibility. And it also gave me, you know, like a dual caliper setup that retained the factory ABS sensor. I know there's one other kit that does allow that. You still give up the factory e-brake, which I did as well, and runs a dual caliper setup, one that hangs off like the lower part of the knuckle so you can keep the ABS sensor, or there's a cheaper weld-on option, but that goes right in where the ABS sensor or the wheel speed sensor is. So a lot of people end up removing that or cutting a lot out of that weld-on bracket that I question if it's gonna hold up long term. So for me to kind of jump to what I think would be the end solution for what I wanted, even if I went in stages, if I did adjustable control arms and then I did, you know, a dual caliper setup that's just a bolt on to the factory knuckle, with that I wouldn't have to worry about the caliper spacing. You know, it's all figured out. That's bolt on, ready to go. Anybody can do it. But I do enjoy the Wisefab adjustability, so I'm looking forward to messing more with that. And I'm sure once we get on the track and I have some laps and some miles on it, that I'll have even more feedback with it, the adjustment, if I like it, if I don't like it, if I think that a street car really even needs the suspension, or if I think that it fixes all the E90 factory geometry issues that you can kind of fix with other solutions, but this just replaces it all and fixes, in my opinion, it all, and from my understanding, fixes it all in one shot. So we still have a lot to do to this car. We have trans swap. We got to get the motor back in it. We got the front subframe to put back in it. We got the front Wisefab narrow kit to put on it. And then we have interior, we have shifter, we have bucket seats, setting up the interior hydro. A lot of stuff left to do on this car. So stay tuned for the rest of this build as those videos come out. And we thank you everybody for watching. Don't forget to like, comment your opinion if you think this is a great setup. If you don't, if you have other opinions, we'd love to hear them. Don't forget to subscribe as well so you can stay tuned, hit that alert button. You know when we post another video and you can stay up to date with everything.